Good day. Today is September 1st, 2025. It's Labor Day. My name is Malakouti Fitzgerald, and I'm a citizenship and immigration attorney, and this is our 31st Mobility Space. We're talking about the hottest topics in dual citizenship, freedom of movement, sovereignty, and of course, passports. Today's space is about the book and the predictions made in the book, The Sovereign Individual. So the book is called The Sovereign Individual, Mastering the Transition to the Information Age. It was published in 1997 by two authors, James Dale Davidson, an American businessman and investor, and William Rees-Mogg, a British editor, columnist, father of I believe current parliamentary minister Jacob Rees-Mogg. And the book, The Sovereign Individual, is really interesting for people in the mobility space because, first of all, it's long and it makes a lot of predictions. And the book was published over 25 years ago today. So we've had some period of time to kind of get an idea of how some of these predictions have shaped up. I'll go over some of these predictions that are made, and we can take this conversation in any direction we want, whatever's interesting. But generally speaking, the general thesis of the government, of the book, is that changes in technology, informational technology, are weakening the nation state, trending towards weakening the nation state, and providing avenues for individuals to act kind of in a more sovereign manner. So I just want to go over a few. I just want to just throw out a few predictions that are made, and we can, anybody wants to take any one of them on, we can certainly do that. One prediction that was made is the increased use of cyber currency. That's what they called it, cyber currency to circumvent governmental control. And in the book, the authors describe encryption technology, okay, as the key to the rise in this cyber currency, and specifically the idea that it's a lot easier to create a key than to decipher the key, right? This book was again published in '97, over 10 years before the creation and rise of Bitcoin. So that's an interesting prediction we could talk about. Number two. There's the expectation that the information technology will democratize talent and create a meritocracy. And the idea is basically that the more that the economy relies on information and basically information creators, the lower the barriers would be for people to basically find their value in the marketplace. I think that's roughly kind of the idea. Third prediction. Decline of the nation state as globalized commerce and information networks make borders increasingly irrelevant, okay? And that this would lead to new forms of sovereignty. So what are we talking about? Well, if the more the economy is online, which is borderless, right, then the less important borders become, the less effective borders become to control people, at least economically. As far as leading to new forms of sovereignty, the books talk about a lot of different scenarios, possible scenarios, but just kind of one common theme that comes up is the idea that eventually people who are sovereign enough, i.e., wealthy enough, would have their own plots of land, issue their own passports, and basically organize in their own way that's kind of in parallel, if not in competition with current nation states. Okay. Another thing that's really interesting that is discussed in the sovereign individual is U.S. exit tax and U.S. citizenship-based taxation and renunciation of U.S. citizenship. And again, we're talking about 1997. Obviously people were already renouncing in 1997. It was not necessarily a new thing, but in terms of primacy in the public eye, obviously content and discussion around the exit tax and renunciation was just a tiny fraction of what it is right now. And even the book even has a line in there along the lines of thinking individuals will renounce U.S. citizenship, right? So that's an interesting one that we could certainly talk about. Couple things. The book didn't really predict the rise of China. The book harps on Hong Kong as a great model of a nation state, a small nation state that could do well. So the book didn't really, talk about, China so much as a rising superpower competing with the United States. But these are a few predictions that I think are really interesting in the book, especially for mobility practitioners and people that are interested in the world of citizenship, freedom of movement. We could take this anywhere we want. If somebody else has another prediction or an aspect that's discussed in the sovereign individual, I would love to hear about it. But I thought we could start off with this. And let me throw a question out there. Okay, the decline of the nation state as globalized commerce and information networks make borders increasingly irrelevant. Okay, 1997, we're in 2025 right now. That's 27 years. Okay, anybody want to step forth with an opinion on whether generally in the last 27 years the nation states have just the nation state in general has declined? Are people more or less controlled generally speaking, by the nation state than they were back then? Let me throw this question out to Patrick first, and tell us what you think, Patrick, and then anybody else can chime in.
Oh, thanks for the first question. That is a great question. Apologies if my connection was off earlier. I'm gonna take this question and approach it a little academically. I think, generally speaking, that is true as it relates to means of like commerce and finance. But I would say, from the perspective of law and freedom of mobility, I would argue that the nation state has more power today than it did 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I'll illustrate that with a couple examples. So, if you are someone who operates a business internationally, which is most businesses nowadays, you can either source talent from abroad seamlessly because of technology. You can pay people in local currencies without taking on significant currency risk. Um, as a consumer, you can open up multi-currency credit cards and debit cards, and there are businesses today that are asynchronous businesses, so they operate irrespective of time zone. So I think all of those things, not just business, but also from a consumer perspective, you are a lot more free today than you were 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Like sourcing, you know, something from abroad is like pretty easy to do. Um, between language, between currency, and everything. If you want like for example, I got a very very inexpensive but niche watch. Not that long ago, I was able to find one of the dealers who sold it from abroad, pay in a currency that was not my own, communicate through a translator, an automated translator, and I had it delivered to my doorstep in like less than a week for something that was essentially a very specific product that had, not that many products out there. It was seamless in a way that you can't do 20, 30 years ago. But from the perspective of the nation state, I would argue that there's more control today. And, uh, passport issuance is, of course, a classic example. But even if you elevate that to um, essentially anything related to control or tracking of information, anything that was born out of legislation from the war on terror in the early 2000s, you used to be able to cross into Canada or back into the United States with a driver's license, which I was able to do when I was a very young kid. I was able to go from Detroit to Windsor, Canada, on an ID. I didn't even have on my parents. I'm sorry, on my parents' driver's license because I was a minor. So, that is completely not true today, right? And there's increasing scrutiny around visa issuances. For those of us who are in the dual citizenship or multi-citizenship world, uh, all of those programs face increasing scrutiny because suddenly the demand for them has increased over the past 5 years. And that doesn't even get to the aspect of taxes or banking, which is uh, heavily regulated, to put it lightly. And from a more like agnostic approach, anything you do from the perspective I mean, even digital currency, crypto, from a crypto perspective, I still think we're not in the first inning on crypto, but I don't think we're to the third inning, to use a baseball analogy. Patience Alpha is not here. I was going to have him make fun of my American analogies here, but I think we're maybe in the second inning on crypto, and the legislation is all over the place, but it shows you that the power of the nation state is there to make sure that it puts its interests first before your own, right? So I think there's kind of two tracks to whether or not we live in a more sovereign or less sovereign world. And I would argue from the perspective of a nation state, it's decreasing. And from the perspective of commercial or economic, on the economic plane, I still think it is increasingly sovereign.
Appreciate it. Jay, can I throw out the same question to you? The question is, since 97, when the Sovereign Individual was published, has globalized commerce and information network led to, even if it's just a little bit, the overall decline of the nation state? Did they get that prediction right? Or are they on track to get that prediction right?
I would say no. I would say that the power of the nation state is probably about the same now as it was in 1997, but because of the internet, because of globalization, more individuals are trying to become more sovereign and trying to use their own tools to migrate to other countries and do various things that maybe were not possible in 1997, which I was not alive in 1997, so I can't comment as to exactly how that was. But I guess I would say that nation states have become more cognizant of the power that they had and have still to control global trade, commerce, migration, and are much more willing to use those powers and see the utility and the reasons for which they would be used. I would say more situations are happening that and more people are aware of them that kind of I wouldn't want to say force the nation states to use more of that power, but incentivize more use of sovereign powers of nation states. So not really. I would say they're about the same in terms of power, but more use as individuals have become more sophisticated.
Got it. My view is the more that nation states tie extraterritorially imposed obligations to a person's nationality, right? The more control they're able to exercise over people, because if they have the enforcement mechanism, they can basically control the person wherever they are in the world, right? Whereas if, to the extent they refrain from those extraterritorial obligations, a person can just pick up and leave, assuming, of course, they have the ability to enter and stay in another jurisdiction. So I see things kind of along those lines. I want to throw out a quote here from the book. We have Brent here. Welcome, Brent. We have John. I'd love for John or Brent to take one of these on if they feel up to it. Otherwise, anybody else is welcome. But on page 306 of the book, it reads, "A Swede or a Dane who wishes to pay high taxes because he believes the Scandinavian welfare state is worth what it costs is actually making a choice. He can elect to be taxed at any rate that prevails in any other jurisdiction in the civilized or uncivilized world. To change his tax rate, he need only move. Technology makes such a choice easier by the moment, yet that option is denied to Americans. Holding a US passport is destined to become a major drawback to realizing the opportunities for individual autonomy made possible by the information revolution." And now I'm skipping ahead about two paragraphs to another portion, another related quote. "Unless US taxes are reformed to become more competitive with those of other jurisdictions and are no longer levied on the basis of nationality, thinking persons will renounce US citizenship, notwithstanding the obstacles imposed by the Clinton exit tax." And of course, that last line is to nod to the fact that this book was written during the tail end of Bill Clinton's presidency. Um, John or Brent, if either of you are able to speak, would like to know if you have any thoughts on that line written 27 years ago in The Sovereign Individual, and whether that's true or not. Okay, maybe neither of them can speak yet. If you guys want to chime in anytime, you're welcome. Can I throw this back to you, Patrick? What do you think about that quote about U.S. citizenship?
I mean, I think I don't know. I guess I take a little bit of a tactical approach to it, but it is important in this context is that it is the thinking person is to renounce U.S. citizenship. And I think that is basically them distilling down that if you as a sovereign individual look on a long enough time horizon, is your citizenship valuable? And for most countries, the answer is yes, because it gives you all of these rights. But for those citizenships that on a long enough time horizon ultimately cost you something, like an exit tax, then a thinking person would say, I don't necessarily want this, and therefore, if there's a path to get out of it, I will. Um, it's like citizenships that require military service. Um, on a long enough time horizon, one of your descendants is going to be serving in that capacity when there's a conflict, right? And so, do you want that? Do you want that burden? If you don't share that burden, are you going to share that burden for your children and their children? And I think that for most people, they don't necessarily want that. With the American citizenship, it's this financial burden saying, oh, you know, being born in, arguably the best or greatest economy is a blessing. But if you're too successful, then it can become a burden on this exit tax. And, I think policymakers in the United States said, we don't want to be shortchanged on the estate tax, basically. And so therefore we're instituting this exit tax. I think it makes a very interesting point, because the assumption is that you're going to be successful enough that this exit tax impacts you. And if that is true, then yeah, maybe a thinking person would explore that opportunity.
Right, and I mean, part of it obviously has to do with what do you think your likelihood is of availing yourself of that option, that benefit, to quote unquote choose your tax rate, right? If you're if you're not willing to arrange your life such a way that you can actually realize a significant material benefit by renouncing, then obviously that's less attractive of an option for you. John Richardson, please, what are your thoughts on the quote written in 97?
Well, I think that my first thought is that it was a quote in 1997, and I actually remember exactly where I was, sitting reading that book at that time. I mean, he goes on to elaborate on that, though, in some interesting ways. One of the points he makes is he actually starts talking about PFIC taxation before anybody knew anything about it. So he was actually making 2 points, and they are important points. I mean, the first was the problem of citizenship taxation per se. Okay, regardless of, separately from the question of how is an American taxed outside the United States. The second point that he made, although less elaborately and perhaps less elegantly, was that he talked about the special tax rules, right, that would apply to American citizens in certain circumstances. And, so I think that the quotation, a thinking person would renounce U.S. citizenship, needs to be viewed in both contexts, right? I mean, first, the problem of it as a general principle, but the second, and he has proven to be prophetic here, is that the simple fact that American citizens with a tax residency outside the United States with foreign source income and assets are taxed far more punitively than a similarly situated U.S. resident would be, resulting in the inability of Americans abroad to effectively manage their finances and plan for a financial future. I mean, I would go further than a thinking person would renounce. I would say a conscious person living outside the United States as a tax resident of another country without very much thought, with just a level of consciousness and awareness, would feel they were forced to renounce. And that's actually what's happening today.
Yeah, so page 306 about the PFICs. This is the quote. If a 747 jetliner filled with one investor from each jurisdiction on Earth touched down in a newly independent country and each investor risked 1,000 in a startup venture in the new economy, the American would face a far higher tax than anyone else on any gains. Special penal taxation of foreign investment, exemplified by the so-called PFIC taxation, plus the US nationality tax, can result in tax liabilities of 200% or more on long-term assets held outside the United States. A successful American could reduce his total lifetime tax burden as a citizen of any of more than 280 other jurisdictions on the globe. So that's the reference that you're talking about. Yeah. I'd say quite prophetic, considering when, how long ago this book was written.
Yeah, if I could just add, going back to the fact that this is 1997, and that's what's so extraordinary about it. 99% of the tax compliance industry had no awareness of the PFIC regime until about 2009, right? So not only was this prophetic in terms of, the effect of the punitiveness of U.S. taxation, but it was really quite extraordinary in that he chooses an example that almost nobody even knew about, right? Except for, him and presumably his researchers. I mean, it's really extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that that portion may have been more sourced by James Dale Davidson, the American businessman, than William Rees-Mogg. But nonetheless, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's certainly extraordinary. What about cyber currency? What about quote unquote cyber currency? Okay, the rise of Bitcoin. Any opinions on? I mean, should we give these authors credit for effectively predicting the rise of Bitcoin? Is that an impressive prediction?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think so. I have not read the book, but which I know I should. I know of the book, but I would argue that that was pretty insightful. I don't know the extent to which they describe the underlying function of how it works, but I think there is such a heavy digital infrastructure for fiat currency, for the USD, from a compliance, uh, everything from payroll to electronic transfers to international foreign exchange. Everything is There's such a significant infrastructure that someone having the ability to create, a currency based on cryptographic hacks and have that scale, I think is, I think at the time that was pretty pie in the sky idea. And so to say that this is, something that is a possibility in the future, I think is a pretty decent amount of foresight, because I don't know anyone in the late '90s who was talking about this. And even when Bitcoin came out of the great financial crisis time frame, even then it was considered quite, the tip of the spear in terms of adoption and understanding. Um, I remember speaking to people about Bitcoin in 2017, and it was still a very misunderstood and nascent industry even back then. So they get some credit for it. To flip it on its head, I don't think people understood, and I still don't think they get a good sense of what that means from the perspective of the nation state. If you have the means to transfer wealth through something outside of the channels of regulatory control, what the policy response is going to look like. You know, I don't know how many people here on the call have tried doing this. I have not, but like, try walking through an international border with over $10,000 in cash, or in heavy metals, precious metals rather, not heavy metals. Oh my goodness, precious metals. And that's a significant burden, right? But if you walk through with a cold wallet of, you know, the equivalent of $50,000 USD in cryptocurrency, you know, there isn't really a mechanism to ascertain that, and that's why we see such this, you know, very diverse policy response from different countries around how cryptocurrency is treated, how it's transferred, how it's taxed, how it's regulated. And I don't know to the extent to which the book covers that policy response, but you know, if you give someone the ability, like with cryptocurrency, to have this level of freedom, you're going to have the Wild West in terms of, you know, speculation. You're going to have some really thoughtful applications of it, but in both scenarios, the government loses control, regulatory control, and so there is going to be a policy response, and usually the first attempt is not the greatest. So uh, I think I don't know the degree to which the book covers that, but I think that that's kind of that second order thinking in terms of how the world will evolve in response to it.
All right. We got Mr. Brent on the line. Brent, can you speak? Can you give us your opinion on especially the line about holding a U.S. passport being destined to be a major drawback?
I'm in an airport. I was just going to add that what was interesting about 1997 as well is that at the time, the exit tax in the U.S. was just this 10-year shadow of capital gains. We didn't have this mark-to-market tax or this covered expatriate regime. And, you know, to be honest with you, 10 years in my mind at the time seemed excessive, but I understand this notion that if you earn a capital gain whilst living in a jurisdiction, you ought to have potentially some obligation to pay tax on that. It didn't necessarily offend me. I thought it was too long. I'm not even really offended by the mark-to-market tax. I think the covered expatriate piece, this idea that you have a shadow for the rest of your life, and any amount that you give to another U.S. person is subject to tax, is what I find to be tricky about expatriating. But it's just quite interesting that he was quite a bit of expansion of the exit tax, I think, as well. Um, when at the time we didn't. That was just you know, that was nowhere, right? Um, but look, I mean, at the end of the day, I have a tension here because you asked earlier, where are we with this? I think we're still very early. I don't think there's a lot of people who are expatriating to leave the sort of or embrace the sovereign individual ideal. I mean, obviously there are some, but I think the majority of expatriations are still probably what I would call accidental Americans, or people who are um, realizing they're never going to go back and are just sick of the compliance burden. And it's not about the tax; it's about the compliance. I don't think we're at the point yet where we are have vast majorities of people who are saying, I'm expatriating to be sovereign, so to speak. But this is an interesting tension because it really raises the question of what is the role of the nation state. And, you know, maybe we are in a very adolescent stage of moving towards a post nation state world where we are more local government. But it's an interesting question. What's the role of a nation state? And it's important for people to remember the historical context that nation states are, you know, they're a relatively recent innovation in the history of the world, which is hard because we've all grown up with them. We live in them. You know, we think about the world in terms of them, but you know, it's actually the modern nation state is a relatively recent historical invention.
Yeah, great points, Brian. I agree with you. I don't have stats for it, but my general impression is that the vast majority of people who are actually renouncing are not doing so to become a sovereign individual. It's more for immediate practical reasons, you know, accidental Americans. Let me throw a question back to you, Brent. So I've said before, and I believe that probably, I mean, there's a lot of different factors, but probably the single factor that holds back more young online entrepreneur Americans from relinquishing their U.S. citizenship is that little bit of uncertainty about whether they'd ever be able to return to visit the United States. That's my opinion. I think that if that was somehow put in place, or some sort of assurance, then we would see I think we'd see a spike in renunciations. What do you think, Brent, is and I know it's a loaded question, but what do you think is the thing, okay, the factor that stops more people from renouncing U.S. citizenship to kind of act on this sovereign individual thesis?
Oh, I think if we got rid of the Reed Amendment, it would make a big difference. There's no doubt a lot of people, once they're made aware of it, look at the issue that if you have renounced for tax motivated reasons, you can't enter the U.S. It's a big deal. But I mean, look, maybe this is naive of me, but I think that most Americans, I'll include myself in this category, because I've lived outside the United States for a long, long time. I still believe in the American ideal in a sense, right? I haven't given that up, and I think most Americans haven't. I think we're in between this, where we haven't lost this, the mythos of America. So this notion that I might never want to live there ever again, I think is it's hard for a lot of people to swallow. So it's not, life is long. And you may have parents there, you may have children that decide that they want to go move there, you want to potentially live there again in the future. It's not an easy decision. You really, your life circumstances have to be such that you're very assured that you have no desire to necessarily visit America again or live there again to, I think, give up that right. And we've seen it even more in the recent news, where being a visitor in America, I'm certainly glad I'm an American when I go back to the U.S. and can go into the U.S. citizen line and not the non-U.S. citizen line. If anything, a lot of the recent news has made me more glad I haven't given up the citizenship. But and that so I think that's a lot of what holds people back. Look, I still have a lot of hope. I think John does too. I mean, I think that I have hope that we will eventually bend towards ending citizenship tax and join the rest of the world and having a more common sense approach to this. But perhaps I'm very naive on this, but I still think that we're going to eventually get to.
Right, and just for the listeners, the numbers we're talking about. So my Freedom of Information Act request asking for numbers of certificates of loss of nationality. The response State Department gave back to me was in fiscal year 2023, 6615. So these are numbers, the number of certificates of loss of nationality issued. And in 2022, 4,798. Of course, this does not mean that the renunciation happened in that year, right? This is kind of a lagging indicator. Of course, we also have our questions and suspicions about how accurate, information is that's returned in a FOIA request. But the point is, we're generally talking in the mid single-digit thousands as of a couple years ago, right? 2022 and 2023. Brent, I agree with you on the Reed Amendment, but I don't think repealing the Reed Amendment would go far enough in assuring potential U.S. renunciants of the ability to come back to visit if they're aware, okay? Because if you repeal the Reed Amendment, well, all the other grounds of inadmissibility still exist for a tourist visa applicant that used to be a U.S. citizen, right? So, they can and will and would be still denied for, immigrant intent, or a past criminal record, or all these other types of things. So I think to be assured the perspective, and again assured, right? We're talking about really, really being assured of being able to come back to visit the United States. I think beyond just the Reed Amendment being repealed, there'd have to be some sort of like carve out for like former citizens or something, that certain grounds of inadmissibility section don't apply to them, or some other status that allows them to visit, something like that, because we don't really have evidence of people being denied based off of the Reed Amendment. The real threat is that they'll be denied for some other ground of inadmissibility, like immigrant intent. John, what do you think here? Oh, go ahead, Brent, if you want to chime in again.
No, no, no. I was just going to say you're probably right. I mean, when I advise people and discuss the Reed Amendment, that suddenly is something that is relevant. I agree, right? I mean, you have no right to enter the United States otherwise. So people, very much realize that they would be at the mercy. So look, I think the people who have renounced, that I have helped renounce, are all ones that, to be honest with you, don't even plan on visiting the U.S. again. Um, Well, with the exception of one person, actually, now that I think about it. But it's it's tricky, but you do have to basically be done with the United States entirely, I think, if you're going to really renounce. And that's a hard thing to know if you're willing to do or not. But those who have done it, as I say, what's always it's always misunderstood. People always assume it's for tax reasons, and it's not for paying tax reasons. I've never had a case with people who are sick of paying the tax. It's the filing and the compliance, and most of the time they don't actually owe much tax. And so I always want to stress that because I don't think we can ever get that message out enough that it's not about actual tax dollars paid. It's compliance burdens and perceived restrictions involving living within these rules that Americans are subject to.
Yeah, can I chime in there?
Of course.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I basically agree with Brent. I have sort of been advocating, suggesting for many years that what the United States ought to do with Americans abroad, if they're really concerned with maintaining some kind of link between taxation and every U.S. citizen, would be to simply say anybody who lives outside the United States and meets the test of, say, the ordinary residence under the under the foreign earned income exclusion, should just be charged, a fixed passport fee or something like that, and leave it at that. The problem, it truly is the compliance, and not only is it the compliance objectively, but for a very large number of people, it's the fear of non-compliance for foot faults. I work with all kinds of people who really are at best middle class, right? And they can't afford they cannot afford tax preparation fees beyond a very, very basic amount, say $500 or something, which is where this stuff starts. It's significant for them. But at that level, they really don't have much assurance that they're really in compliance when we get into all the information returns and things like that. And I cannot overemphasize how terrifying it is, how terrifying of an experience it is for these people who, believe that modest non-compliance can result in these, horrendously exorbitant penalties. So I think I would add that, and I'm thinking very much too, I was actually in the tax preparer's office this week, discussing this. And what was happening was that the woman was literally being frightened out of her U.S. citizenship. And, this is absolutely wrong. I mean, citizenship taxation is wrong on every level, period. But it's far worse than just citizenship taxation. Eritrea has technically citizenship taxation. But to compare the United States to the nation of Eritrea is clearly a gross insult to the nation of Eritrea, given how much worse the United States really is, right? So, as Brent points out, it's complexity, it's compliance costs, it's the opportunity cost of the inability to invest in a lot of things that your friends and neighbors can. I mean, whether you can or not is not so much the point. People think they can't. They can't get the right kind of advice. But I think most particularly, it's the tremendous fear of foot faults, penalties, and things like that. So my observation of this over the years is that if one's DNA is that they're going to live outside the United States, and they feel very, very strongly that they want to be absolutely tax compliant, these are the people who renounce or they're more inclined to renounce because they just don't feel they can do that. I mean, whether true or not, I don't know. But they go to tax preparer 1 who tells them this about their small business. They go to tax preparer 2 that tells them something else. Then they go online and read about all the horror stories for penalties, and they just don't want any part of it.
Well, John, I was just thinking about something as you were talking. It occurred to me for the first time, which is because I have this friend of mine who I debate about the citizenship-based tax quite a bit, and he always points out the fact that you don't want to renounce indicates that the U.S. citizenship has value, and therefore it's something you ought to pay for. But it occurred to me as you were just talking there that, in fact, somebody who renounces U.S. citizenship and is arriving at the border has more risk of non-entry than sort of your average person from the Netherlands or France who's showing up on an ESTA visa. And because you have this sort of, why did you renounce? What's the motivation? What's your immigration intent, et cetera? And so what stops people from renouncing is this idea that they know that if they renounce and they want to go back to the U.S., there's some degree of a stigma just as a visitor, right? And this uncertainty as to whether you can get in. So in a way, you could argue you're materially worse off being a former U.S. citizen showing up at the border under an ESTA visa than as a normal ESTA visa arrival, which is interesting. I had never really thought about that as an argument before to sort of push back against the idea that it's not necessarily that I don't want to renounce because I view so much value of the U.S. It's more I don't want to be in this category of former U.S.
I think that there's a great deal of truth in that. When I have these conversations with people about renunciation, the vast majority of them very early on ask, well, if I renounce, does that mean I can't visit the United States anymore? Right now, I'm in Toronto, Canada, so certainly I think the majority of people I work with are Canadians, and they're in a very privileged position, in the sense that, as you know, Canadians can enter the United States with just a U.S. passport. Doesn't mean they can't be denied admission, for any of these grounds, but certainly it's a lot easier for them. But I don't know who I was discussing this with. I wonder if it was you, Brent, on a previous space. But another client once who was worried about this, and he was I think a British citizen. And I said, well, so you're going to get an S. It shouldn't be a problem. But then he says, well, you know what? I visited North Korea sometime no, you know what? It was with you, Parviz. I think on a Twitter exchange. And that was causing him, the angst, etc. So the problem is a lot of rules, a lot of potential penalties. Hard to consolidate and understand the rules. But the people who are punished most are the people who want to be law-abiding and compliant. There's no question about that. Those are the people who worry about these kinds of things.
I just want to say, Brent, I definitely would agree with your friend. Both in theory and in practice, or in my opinion, a renunciant is in a worse position trying to enter the United States visa-free than somebody who never had U.S. citizenship. One, obviously, because of the Reed Amendment, but then also on a practical matter, if you've been a U.S. citizen, and okay, so I'm talking about U.S. citizens, let's say other than accidental Americans, but if you're a U.S. citizen and if you lived for a couple of decades in the United States, you've created a huge paper trail, right? Just the same way everybody does that lives their life in a particular country. And that paper trail can provide subject matter for a finding of inadmissibility, right? It's more history, it's more information, right? That U.S. officials, whether it be the consular officials at the moment of adjudicating your tourist visa application, or whether it be CBP at the moment you're trying to enter, it's more information that they can access, right? In addition to the Reed Amendment. Also, I mean, just as a fun fact, we've spoken about this before, even though it's probably has marginal impact, if any. U.S. citizenship renunciants cannot own and purchase and handle and possess firearms in the United States. So they're mentioned under the list of prohibited individuals in 18 U.S.C. 922G, which is just funny, and it's just funny that that U.S. citizen renunciants are targeted in that way. And then also, I guess I'll just dump this out because it's something funny that I found in totally unrelated research about 6 months ago. U.S. citizen renunciants are excluded from waiver eligibility for certain certain grounds of inadmissibility for T visa applicants. Okay, T visas for victims of human trafficking, right? So if you're a U.S. citizen, you renounce that citizenship, you somehow become trafficked to or within the United States, but you're inadmissible because you did something that made you inadmissible. you don't have access to a waiver of inadmissibility by virtue of being a renunciant, which is just so random and out there. I wonder if that's ever been, come up actually, because there's not that many T visa applicants per year. But the upshot is, yeah, I definitely would agree with your friend. Maybe not by much. Maybe it's not a huge, delta. But in my opinion, somebody who's never been a U.S. citizen that's presenting themselves either for a B2 tourist visa application or an online, application for ESTA, they just have a cleaner profile, right, than somebody who's a former U.S. citizen. John, also just one other thing you just remind me of when you're talking about a visit to North Korea. Certain American citizens who have a close connection with, a naughty country in the eyes of the United States are shielded by their U.S. citizenship, right? So if you're a U.S. Iranian dual citizen, for example, right, and you renounce U.S. citizenship and you visit Iran, okay, you're going to have a heightened level of screening to apply for a B2 tourist visa, and you're not going to be eligible for ESTA. Okay, because even if that person, would say, was also a French citizen, so a triple French American Iranian citizen, they renounced the American citizenship. Now they're just French and Iranian. France is a visa waiver country, but those people are excluded if they visited, one of a number of countries, one of which is Iran since 2011. So in that way, for that profile, and of course that's in kind of a niche circumstance, not that niche though, because there's a lot of there's over a few million American dual citizens who are citizen of the United States and one of these other countries, to whom a visit would exclude a person from ESTA. If you're in that situation, you have, I would argue, more to lose by renouncing U.S. citizenship. So that's kind of a unique drawback.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. But to generalize your point, okay, if somebody's thinking about renouncing U.S. citizenship, the question is, what citizenship are you left with, right? And what might that mean? Because what you're describing is a different set of circumstances for different kinds of citizens, et cetera, right?
Absolutely.
So this stuff is a very, very serious problem, and I think obviously, well, I think it's obvious, okay, that for younger people starting out in life in their 20s, early 30s, what have you, it's probably not a great idea to renounce U.S. citizenship unless you have a compelling reason, right? But all citizenships, I think, depreciate in value as you get older and older, right? And not only does U.S. citizenship depreciate in value, but it becomes more problematic the older people get, because that's the point where they start getting into, streams of income that are investment and stuff like that. But just, think about this, right? What are we really talking about? We're talking about the problems of citizenship taxation, or more specifically, this crazy nut bar idea. Here's what citizenship taxation really means in practice. It means that the United States looks into other countries, declares certain tax residents of those other countries as belonging to the U.S. for tax purposes, and then taxes them on income that has nothing to do with the U.S. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, and to be honest with you, John, we're focused on tax because that's the most egregious example. But it's, if you broaden it out, it's an interesting question of what is the purpose of citizenship? What's it mean? In effect, it's belonging to a tribe, right? That's how I guess I would say it. And because it's beyond just tax, right? It's export control laws, it's sanctions laws, it's
Yeah.
there's a whole host of other laws that sort of get lost in this because the tax issue is particularly with Americans and it's such a focus. But it's an interesting question as to what are the back to law school type sticks bundle of sticks with property law. But what are those that come along with citizenship? In other words, what rights do you get? What obligations do you owe? And
Well,
we're in an interesting time in the world because we're in effect becoming more isolationist. All countries in a way are a bit, and it's an interesting question as to who should be a citizen, what those rights ought to be, and what those obligations ought to be.
and I think also, I mean, I think the effect of all of these things, right, is that citizens become, tools or instruments of U.S. foreign policy, right, in certain ways. And, for example, look at something like the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act, right? Do you really want to live your life having to be subject to that if you're living in a part of the world where that stuff is irrelevant, right? Do you
Yeah,
want,
no, that's a good example.
yeah, do you want theoretical travel bans? I mean, I remember President Carter once talking about, sort of lamenting the fact that somehow, U.S. citizens can't go to Cuba or places like this, right? Just because they're U.S. citizens. I mean, this is the issue, and I think one of the most interesting examples of this was, yeah, I'm 99% sure that nobody except me on this call was alive in 1974, but in 1974, Bobby Fischer, right, the former U.S. chess champion, was getting ready to play chess in Iceland against the Soviet champion Boris Spassky. And, the U.S. government, Henry Kissinger, put tremendous pressure on him to go up there, right? To sort of, represent the United States, as if somehow or other this had anything to do with the United States. And what did the United States do to, turn Fischer into a chess genius? Nothing, right? But the point is that because he was a U.S. citizen, there's a view that, that he was there for available to be able to and somehow obligated, to go represent the United States in this capacity, right? Or then, it's funny. I mean, sort of in '74 we have that. We go back to Fischer in the early '90s, and then they were upset that he did a rematch with Spassky in Serbia. And that started all kinds of problems because I think they were arguing that he was in violation of some kind of U.S. sanction law by playing chess in Serbia, if you can imagine. I mean, these things they're not a problem for 99% of people. But the trouble with this type of thing, the trouble with citizenship-induced problems, is that once they arise, they're never small problems, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Brent. I also think about citizenship kind of as belonging to a tribe, and when you're talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? And I'll just put it in more blunt terms. What John was saying. So, in some parts of the world, you don't survive in business unless you basically, grease palms, right, of government officials, and it's not against the law in many parts of the world, many countries. So, as an American or somebody else that's citizen of a country that has a similar act to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you basically can't compete you cannot, in that part of the world if you have this restriction on you, right, legally, and if you observe that restriction. There's a whole bunch of other types of restrictions based off citizenship, and I believe, and I basically have the position that the key point is has to apply extraterritorially to you, because if it doesn't apply extraterritorially to you, if it just applies territorially, then everybody's subject to it in the country. It's not a restriction that's based on citizenship. It doesn't flow from citizenship. But we have domestic mandatory military service, international sanctions, restrictions or prohibitions on renunciation of citizenship, restriction on foreign military service. So, for example, if you're a citizen of a country that has in its law that you cannot be in a foreign military, mercenary service restriction, prohibition on service in foreign legislatures, financial, prohibition on financial transactions in certain countries. Okay, North Korea, Iran. Financial transactions with targeted individuals. Those are SDNs for Americans, specially designated nationals. The list that's put out by the U.S. Treasury Department. Travel to prohibited countries, which John, of course, touched on. Bigamy, restricted speech, right? These are all types of laws. I'm not saying that these apply, to citizens of all countries, but these are all types of laws that countries can impose on their nationals extraterritorially. Okay, so those are the restrictions, and like John said, it might just seem like some far off fuzzy thing that doesn't apply to you until it does, right? And when I speak to people and when I hear kind of people talking on this, one of the misconceptions that I hear, or that I think is a misconception, is that people automatically go to information sharing. Oh, how would they know? They would your home country wouldn't know that you're doing this, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, maybe they don't have the information now, but in my experience, uh, so many times people self-snitch by accident, okay, because people have to fill out forms, people have to present information, documents when they're applying for different things, licenses for different things, purchasing different things, and these forms and these documents throw off information. Vast majority of people don't read everything that they sign, or sometimes anything that they sign, or anything that they present, right? As lawyers, we're kind of paranoid, and we're kind of conditioned to constantly check things, but average person doesn't do that, and so they quote unquote self snitch. And this is the flip side of becoming a citizen, a sovereign individual, via multiple citizenship. Picking up additional citizenships is not just all benefits. It's not all just core residency rights, passports, extra visa free travel. It's also picking up these extra territorially imposed obligations.
Well, so I think a reasonable question is, to anybody is why do you want another citizenship, right? So let's say you're an American or Canadian or probably Australia, probably a citizen of any one of these, say G7 countries at least. You can go to, the UK, you can go to Europe for, I think, up to 6 months, right? Or, if it's less than that, it's still a substantial period of time. The only, I think that multiple citizenships have value. If you want the right to stay much longer, that would be the first. Or, specifically, if you want to create the predicate to renounce something like U.S. citizenship. But, I know people who collect citizenships, right? The way other people collect painting, or some people collect stamps, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. Okay, because I think that at a certain point, I think it can become very, very risky.
Yeah, I'll take that one, John. A lot of the reason is because there's different gradations in ability to enter, right? U.S. or not U.S. Generally in citizenship, right? You have the highest immediate right of entry, right? Then you generally could say next down the line is permanent residence, then temporary residence, then tourist visa, then an electronic travel authorization like ETA or ESTA. And people, some people want to have a more robust access to a part of the world. You have access to travel to the UK, to use your example, right? Uh, requesting an electronic travel authorization, but those ask questions, and certain people are more vulnerable to the questions that are asked. Typically,
Yeah,
people with previous.
well, yeah, you're right. I see your point. Yeah, you're right.
And so, I mean, there's different sources of a person's ability to enter a country, and they have different levels of strength, right? So, for movement within the European Union, which is one of the most prized mobility assets kind of in the industry, right, in the world, it's the TFU, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, Article 21, right? It's a pretty robust right. It's pretty proven, right? It's going to be difficult to deny a Czech citizen from travel to France, okay, uh, you know, under that article, right? It's tried and tested. Even if that Czech guy, is saying nasty things online, even if he's convicted of a misdemeanor, even if he's convicted of a felony, right? And so, as I made a post before, and I'm working on an article about this. I made a post about how visa free is becoming visa light. What we've known most of our life as visa free is dying out. And what I mean by that is you got your passport, it says you're a citizen of whatever country in that passport, and you show up to the border. You book a flight, you show up to the border, and that's it. That's what I call true visa free. That's going the way of the dodo bird. We're moving to Visa Lite, which is electronic travel authorizations, a quick application online if everything goes perfectly, at least a couple days ahead of your visit, and then an approval, and then you can enter. Well, the thing is, once you start filling out forms, and John, you know this better than anyone, but most people probably on this call know this. If you're filling out a form in order to be able to do something, that means you could be denied. Okay, that implies the possibility of denial. And so, as the world moves away from true visa free to what I call visa light, right? The visa free access, quote unquote, that's provided by a person's citizenship, it's diminishing, it's degrading in value compared to what it was previously. So in order to have a robust access to those places, people are having to, not having to, but if they want to have that robust access, they got to upgrade either to a temporary residence permit or in the best case scenario citizenship if they can do so. And of course, if having that citizenship doesn't incur one of those red flags of second citizenship that we were talking about earlier. But yeah, that would be my answer to why people are doing it. It's because visa free access is not reliable and it's dying out. True visa free access.
Yeah. Well, that's a very, very good point.
Well, and
Yeah.
I would go further and say that it's funny because sovereign individual used to mean, or at least we always think about this in terms of minimize your taxes. But I think in a world of uncertainty, true sovereignty is the ability to go and live where you want, right? And in some regards, um, more access to be able to live because of the uncertainty in each of these countries. To say I'm going to self-select out of this. And, some people might argue that lacks courage, whatever. That's not the right thing to do. But apart from the judgment call, just the ability to have to say, I don't want to be in this environment anymore. I want to go live over here. Um, Maybe that's what true self-sovereignty is. And in that context, you need the residency rights in multiple places.
Brent,
That's what,
that's the
yeah.
Malakouti thesis. That is exactly what I harp all the time. It's the option. Okay.
Yeah, and can you still hear me? By the way, I mean my point. The U.S. would be part of that, right? I mean, the U.S. does, for all of its faults, it has two gigantic oceans on either side, right? So in certain scenarios, it's a great place to be. Oh, I was just saying that. I mean, it's not irrational to say that the United States is a good option in the context of a world of uncertainty. In the sense of over the span of some period of time, it has two oceans on either side. It's very hard to get to, if in certain, so it's not crazy to think that the United States gives you some degree of that same optionality. So maybe paying the tax is worth the price, right? Especially when you consider all of the territories and just how expansive the United States is. So, it depends what you're hedging against. It depends what you're worried about as a sovereign individual.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I don't know if I'm losing the connection or if we're losing Parvis. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way. I think that's a good framework to look at it. Can you guys hear me, or is it my connection?
No, it's not just you. I can hear you
Oh,
loud
okay,
and clear.
cool. Parvis, I think we're missing your connection. Um, yeah, I think the point you made is pretty spot on. For a lot of people, it is that option. Like the option is the hardest part to acquire, to live not in the United States, but that option is inherently valuable in and of itself. And I mean, the United States, as kind of one of the, depends how you look at the world, but as a global hegemon, a place where there is jobs and an economy, and there's a lot of varied places to live with a lot of options for lifestyles. you know, it is nice. It is nice, and particularly if you have family here, and want to visit without dealing with some significant visa issues. Yeah, I think a lot of people do love that optionality, and find it to be worth the tax piece, um, and
Well,
worth
I
the
mean,
compliance piece.
if you took away the tax base, right? If Trump actually delivered on this gold cards, I actually do believe there's a lot of people in the world that would pay for that because they may not move there, but the optionality of the United States is valuable. The tax piece and the compliance piece is a headache, and a lot of Americans want to escape it. But in terms of just if you look at the globe and the amount of geography the United States takes up, if what you're hedging for is something other than tax, if you're hedging for political instability, or if you're hedging for climate change, or if you're hedging for it just depends what you're hedging for. The U.S. may have an option that is valuable in your portfolio of hedges, right? So, and I think that's what a sovereign person ought to be, right? A true sovereign individual can go where they want. That would be my definition of it.
Yeah,
And the only tricky thing is we've allowed these nation states to creep. And it's not just the Americans. I mean, if we move beyond tax and we talk about speech regulation and fiscal controls and sanctions and everything else, we have a lot of guilty parties in terms of nation states that are acting extraterritorially and authoritarianly and expansively. And so, unfortunately, I think we're just in that phase of the world that we're just in that, pendulum swing at the moment. So that, but hopefully someday it will head, swing the other direction. But in my mind, a sovereign individual would be silly to also ignore the U.S. as a good. It is not a bad option as far as giving you certain optionality.
Yeah, I want to exactly put the pin in what you said because I agree with it. And that is the value of the option. And you look at the map of countries whose citizenships require a visa just to visit the United States, and that speaks nothing to, banking or right to open an LLC and all that stuff, but just the right to visit. And it is such a small map of countries that don't require a visa to visit the United States, and it's for 90 days, right? The only country, and Parvez will back me up on this if we have this connection, that can visit up to 180 days. Believe the only country is Canada. Um, and
There is
so,
another. There is another. It's Bermuda, but they're
oh, that
really the
makes
people who live there.
that
When we're
makes sense.
talking about visa issues, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that when U.S. citizenship renunciants have to apply for a visa, the consular officer will be checking all of the boxes that are being used for nationals of that particular country in normal situations. Like, oh, do you have relatives in the US? Do you have connections in the US? Do you have a spouse who is a US citizen? And all of those things, when applied to a national of that country, would probably be potentially a good look into whether that person would be likely to overstay or not. When applied to a former US citizen, all of them are, or at least a large portion of those red flags are probably going to be true about this person. And that doesn't mean that they will necessarily overstay. They probably won't because they renounce their citizenship for a reason. But they probably will, in some cases, get denied because of that standard that's being applied to them for use on people who have lived their entire lives outside of the US.
Yeah, those are all ties to the United States that would be factors for potential denial under INA 214B, immigrant intent, which is the most common reason that people are denied a tourist visa to visit the United States. And a famous example is Andrew Henderson of Nomad Capitalist. He made a YouTube video earlier this year talking about how he applied for a tourist visa to enter the United States after he had renounced his U.S. citizenship, and he was denied for immigrant intent, right? I've often wondered, there's no, there's no distinct, there's no certain, analysis of whether the fact that you're announced, increases or decreases the chances of a denial for immigrant intent. I also see the countervailing argument that if you had the access to the United States, to live, and you gave it up, well, that should be that could be or should be used as evidence that you don't have intent to live in the United States. So I could see how these things could cut both ways. But the fact of the matter is, you're in front of all consular official who's making a decision, usually a snap decision. I mean, these are not things that are just evaluated carefully. B2 tourist visas adjudications are made in a matter of minutes, literally, and sometimes a minute, right? And yeah, having all that family in the United States, U.S. citizen, wife, all that type of stuff, yeah, that could be used against you when you're trying to come back in. I just want to. I was disconnected, but I reconnected when Brent was talking about I think the landmass of the United States and United States as a play or part of a sovereign individual's plan. And yeah, I absolutely agree. I think landmass is a criminally underrated factor in the strength of a citizenship. And I've said this before in previous spaces multiple times. This is part of the reason I scoff at so-called citizenship strength lists that put at the very top of them countries that are micro states, right? And I don't want to pick on any country in particular, but that some people on this call might know kind of some of the ones I'm referring to. In my opinion, if the citizenship only offers immediate highest right of entry, so I'm talking about core residency rights, not satellite residency rights in other countries, a residency right that citizens get by virtue of a treaty. But if you're talking about immediate highest right of residency, okay, in a landmass that's a tiny speck on the earth, to me, that's an automatic deal breaker for considering that like to be one of the top citizenships, right? So landmass matters, and it's not just landmass, but it's different environments. It's different, if you like the cold, you can live someplace in the United States, Turkey, Mexico. There's other countries that kind of have this type of diversity as well. I think that's a huge factor, okay, and it's one that's underrated. Okay, just how big is the country? How many different environments does it provide? So I think I came in on the tail end of Brent speaking. I think that's kind of the point that he was trying to make. If he wasn't, then I'm making that point now.
Yeah, I obviously agree, but I also agree that just the option itself is valuable, right? We all speak about, I'm originally from California, and so people always joke that you can surf and ski in the same day there, which I have done before. Um, is that a lifestyle you want to do every day? No, but the point is that the option is valuable in and of itself, and so you know it goes back to the point Brent was making, which is that we all are joking about the Trump gold card, and all meme commentary is hilarious and generally very applicable, but I think all that memery undervalues the point that the option to visit the United States is inherently valuable, and there's a way. I'm sure there is a way to do it thoughtfully, where it would raise the money that the Trump gold card purports to supposedly raise. But the point is that the right to visit or the right to see family, especially under non-immigrant intent, is inherently valuable to a lot of people, and that's evident with the U.S. Immigration Service. But I would argue that the United States has done a pretty poor job understanding that and monetizing it in a way that doesn't have like big political repercussions.
If anybody's interested in surf and ski on the same day, you could surf at Malibu, Santa Monica, California, and then go to Big Bear or Mount Baldy if you don't want if you want a lower quality mountain, and that can be done. It's only about an hour and a half to 2 hour drive. That can be done in the same day, like Patrick said. Yeah, absolutely. Options, right? Are that's the name of the game. And the way I just
let me ask you this:
go ahead, Brent.
Have you had any client? Or any experience? I've not had this, but we're on the topic of optionality. I mean, if your child is a U.S. citizen or your spouse, for that matter, arguably you have. I mean, not arguably, you unquestionably have a way to get back to the U.S. Right? So if you give up your citizenship, your child is a U.S. citizen, they can sponsor you as a parent. Again, assuming the law doesn't change, that's the only limitation to this optionality. If they're living in the U.S., they can sponsor you, and they have enough income, they can sponsor you get a green card, right? So I've never really pushed this too far because I've never had anyone too interested in this, but it's an interesting question, which have you actually lost your optionality of the United States if you're, within your immediate, you keep someone a U.S. citizen?
Great question, Brent. So I've never had somebody do that, but you're absolutely right. Just a few caveats that I'll outline. The children have to be 21 years old or older in order to petition for the parents. Spouse, there's no age limit, but you're absolutely right. And not only is that an option, but those two categories are what we call immediate relative visa categories, which means you're not subject to a visa becoming open, per the visa bulletin. There's always a visa available to you. That doesn't mean you get it instantaneously. There's still processing time issues. But yeah, that's a great point, Brent. Have you renounced U.S. citizenship with a little bit keeping your toe in there as far as optionality if you have one of these family members that can petition for you? The path is definitely there. I cannot say that I've from experience that I've had a client that's done that yet. Hasn't happened for me. John, have you seen that in your practice?
Sorry, seen what specifically?
U.S. citizen renounces and then decides that they want to make their way back through a family petition. So an adult son or daughter, or a
No,
spouse that's a U.S. citizen.
I'm not actually saying that, but I've discussed that. Generally in the context of well, you've got family members who are U.S. citizens, right?
Yeah. So
I mean,
that's
I would argue that any person relying on that needs to be aware that that's not some unqualified, constitutional right. The law could change, so it's not something that you necessarily can plan on if you're giving up your U.S. citizenship. You got to be aware that, who knows how long family. Uh, the idea that this element of the U.S. law, which is, by the way, very unique, right? The U.S. for European countries don't offer this same. Most European countries, I should say, don't in their immigration law have this same idea that a child can petition for a parent or certainly not siblings, right? So, but in current U.S. law, that's how it is, and so to the extent it remains, it does give you an option in theory.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I would just piggyback on what you were saying, by adding that as an applicant for legal permanent residence, you're still subject to all of those grounds of inadmissibility that we talked about earlier that could stop you from being able to visit the United States. So INA 212, right? It's all the grounds of inadmissibility. So if you have, to John's point, right, what's your profile? So if you are, have a past criminal conviction, or if you've done something else to make you inadmissible on potential security grounds. So if you're palling around with dictators, Kadyrov or whatever, or if you have a health condition, that could, make you inadmissible, then obviously, that those could all trip you up on trying to return back as a beneficiary from a family petition. But yeah, Brent's point is well taken. To the extent that the law stays that way and that you're not excludable or inadmissible, yeah, that's potentially a path back if you want. And also to the extent
I've never looked at whether
and,
the Reed Amendment, how that intersects with family petition. But in question, the other thing is, I gotta leave. My flight is boarding, but it's been a good to participate in space, and I'll talk to you all
thanks,
later.
Brent.
Bon voyage.
All right, we got great attendance here. It's 12:23 where I am. We'll be going for about an hour and 20 minutes now. I was disconnected for about 5 minutes, but it seems like there was hearty conversation when I returned. Does anybody else have anything else that they want to that they want to discuss? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up and start talking about topics for our next space. And look, The Sovereign Individual is such a huge book. We've just scratched the surface. We could also have another space down the line talking about other aspects of the sovereign individual.
So
Yeah, Parvis, I'd like to add.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead,
John.
Andrew.
I'll be real quick. So, yeah, I'll be real quick. So I get into these spaces quite often, and it's always legislation that's the topic. It's never the fundamentals, and I'm a big believer in fundamentals. And so you guys I just bopped in here, and the conversation was talking about. I assume, I'm making a presumption here, but I assume you were talking about a non-citizen or a citizen that gave up citizenship, which would be a non-citizen, that wanted to return to America to a family member. And there's all kinds of legislation that would hint at. And I don't see a problem with that, to be honest with you. But the family member in the States has a liberty right. And that liberty right, I don't think, is probably being leveraged to bring that foreign person back to be with the family member who is a citizen. So right off the top of my head there, that's the first argument I went to when I heard this, and I wonder if John or if any of you guys ever thought about utilizing right argument over legislation.
I mean, I'd have to, I'd have to kind of know, I'd have to think of a specific scenario where we'd have to make that argument. As you were talking, one case comes to my mind, not my case, but a Supreme Court case from a year ago, in which a spouse U.S. citizen petitioning for the alien spouse, who was denied. challenged the doctrine of consular non-reviewability under, I believe it was under the, you know what, I don't even want to continue speaking on it. It was based off of some constitutional right, and I can't even remember, so I don't want to talk further on it. But no, I've never used that particular argument. I try to go with what the letter of the law is to begin with. But I'm not I'm not litigating these cases. I'm not a litigator. I'm more doing affirmative application.
Gotcha. You can go, John. Thanks.
I'm just kind of curious how many people have read the complete book, The Sovereign Individual?
I have.
So, Parvis, anybody else?
I have not, but I did download the audiobook, which I'll be starting this afternoon.
I would actually suggest that The Sovereign Individual, if you're going to read it, he's got some earlier books that are really, really interesting and have some relevance, I think, in understanding what he's saying in The Sovereign Individual. And they're much earlier. They go back to the 80s, I think the late 80s. But one of them is Blood on the Streets. These are the same two people, Lord William Rees-Mogg and James Dale Davidson. And the other one, which is incredibly controversial, was The Great Reckoning. And, the larger theme with these things is, general instability in the world. Now, the first two books, I mean, you read The Sovereign Individual, right? He makes this distinction between the industrial age and the new digital age, right? Which he's really writing about. But what they all have in common is sort of, instability, right? And how to understand the effects of instability, perhaps how to behave, etc. But what really would have been interesting, so Sovereign Individual was written just a few years before the whole 9/11 thing. And I think that the U.S. response to the 9/11 thing has really exacerbated a lot of the problems that Americans abroad, at least, are experiencing today.
Yeah, absolutely. Since 9/11, we've experienced a great expansion in the surveillance state. And that's, I would argue, not a good thing for individual rights and civil liberties. The Overton window on what state action is acceptable for security-related grounds, shifted, jerked, I would say, right after 9/11. Although I would say it's kind of moving back now. People are becoming more aware and angry and upset, with kind of the liberties that the state has taken over them, at least in the United States. But yeah, those are good suggestions. I've been wanting to read Blood in the Streets for a while. Maybe I'll kick that off in the next couple weeks. But yeah, the pair did, Davidson and Rees-Mogg did publish a number. I want to say 5 books, I think, at least together. I've only read The Sovereign Individual.
Well, it's incredibly rich thinking. There are, as always, plenty of hecklers and those who disagree, but The Sovereign Individual, given that it came out in 1997, it's really an incredible book, isn't it? Just sort of as a thought experiment, right? Sitting there at that time. Bear in mind, he probably would have started in like 1995, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's 30 years old. They wrote the predictions 30 years ago, and yeah, I would say it's incredible. What they were able to predict. Obviously they're not going to bat 100. Nobody does. But they go pretty specific on a lot of these predictions. It's not they don't stay kind of in entirely in the safe area. Vague, hand wavy type of generalized. Predictions. So yeah, I think it's incredible. I found that the Bitcoiner community is a big fan of the book, and then kind of a lot of people in what I would consider the multiple citizenships, sovereignty / freedom community. They're both, they both kind of hold the sovereign individual as a cult classic from what I've seen.
What's interesting about it is I'd be interested in your view of this, but I do not interpret those two authors as being, particularly, sovereign individual focused, right? I see them as really just more people with a predisposition to being historians trying to make sense of the major changes in the world.
I mean, I don't know enough about them personally to be able to tell you like how sovereign they were. But saying that this is what's coming, right? That's not necessarily inconsistent with not being able to exercise that status just yet.
Yeah.
By the way, James Dale Davidson is still alive. It would be interesting to get him on a podcast. And,
well, you ought to see if you can try. I actually was once at a presentation that he gave in Toronto, probably in the early 1990s, and it was interesting. It was after the Great Reckoning came out. Very,
okay.
very rich thought in those books. Let's just see what comes up for this guy right now, James Dale Davidson.
He doesn't have a huge footprint as far as appearances on podcasts, but I did see that he was interviewed by a Bitcoiner on the What Is Money show. I forget the name of the host, but I think that was about a year ago. He's out there. I think that was about a year or two ago. He seemed to be in good health.
Well, let's see what he's got here. 79 years old. I mean, clearly coming of age in the industrial age, right? Not the digital age. Adding, to how amazing the sovereign individual actually was, right?
Yeah, and we didn't even touch on how much history the sovereign individual goes over about the shift throughout time, in what he calls economies of violence, meaning whether technology makes it easier to defend or easier to take, and he makes they make the argument that people are generally more sovereign when power is decentralized, when technology makes it cheaper to defend than to attack, and that people become less free, right, when it's easier, when it's cheaper to attack than to defend. It's I love that whole discussion. We haven't even spoken about that. Maybe that'll be for another space if there's sufficient interest.
You ought to reach out to him. Maybe send in the recording of this one. You ought to reach out to him.
Yeah, I'll probably do so. I'll probably do so. All right, so it's 12:35 Pacific Standard Time. We've been going for about an hour and a half. This has been a great discussion. I want to thank everybody who tuned in. As a reminder, this is our 31st mobility space. We're doing 50 mobility spaces this year on the hottest topics in citizenship, freedom of movement, sovereignty. And we cover all different types of topics. If it has to do with freedom of movement and dual citizenship and sovereignty, we're on it. So as a reminder, anybody can speak. So if you're listening to this and you want to chime in, you don't have to wait for the golden invitation. Just hit the request button and I'll approve it right away. That said, we're going to do our 30-second mobility space on Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Does anybody have a topic that they would like to put forth? If they do, come forth. Let us know the topic you suggest, okay? If not, then we'll let the interwebs decide via poll, as I usually do, poll on X. Anybody have something that they want to put forth? Okay, so we've been pushing off passport validity periods. That's been one that we've been saying, let's consider this one, let's consider this one. If nobody comes forth, I'm going to make that the topic of our next space. Passport validity periods, 10 years versus 5 years. What does it mean? What does it mean as far as long-term strategy, right, for decentralizing your legal identity and your ability to travel? I think that's interesting enough to discuss in conjunction with, what passports are used for, what they can be used for, and kind of how having more than one passport, not citizenship, passport, having more than one passport increases a person's freedom. So We're going to make that the topic. I want to thank everybody for joining, including the anonymous listeners, and have a great week. Make sure to tune in for our Thursday 30-second mobility space.